In the previous episode of this two-part series, we discussed why the West is eating its own bones, why the Muslims will conquer the West, and why Israel will be last man standing. In this episode, we will discuss the disease itself and its mutation in modern times. The disease that leads the white man and his glorious past to self-destruct. Civilizations are rarely murdered. They commit suicide. If you look at the great empires of the past, Rome, Greece, the Byzantines, they didn't die because the barbarians at the gate were stronger than the legions. They died because the people inside the walls stopped believing they deserved to exist. They lost their will before they lost their territory. But suicide is rarely a sudden decision. It is a long, slow, festering sickness. And in the case of the modern West, we can pinpoint exactly when the infection started. To understand the death of the West, you have to look at the difference between 1945 and 1960. In 1945, the white Western man was at his absolute peak. He was the victor. He was masculine, unapologetic, and confident. He looked absolute evil in the eye in Berlin and Tokyo, and he had crushed it. There was no doubt in the Western soul. Western civilization was the good guys, and everyone knew it. But then came the stalemate in Korea. Then came the absolute disaster in Vietnam. For the first time in human history, war wasn't a distant rumor. It was broadcast into the American living room every single night. The post-World War II man saw the blood, saw the burning villages, saw the body bags. And for the first time, the West flinched. But this wasn't just a tactical retreat. It was a spiritual collapse we hadn't seen since Rome opened its gates to the barbarians. That confidence of 1945 didn't just evaporate, it was surrendered. GI was replaced by the hippie, and the legionnaire was replaced by the apologist. We treat the 1960s counterculture like it was just a phase, a moment of peace and love. It wasn't a phase. It was the patient zero event for the modern version of oikophobia, the fear of home, the hatred of one's own culture. This new generation didn't just rebel against their fathers. They rejected the very foundations of the civilization their fathers built. They rejected the flag, they rejected God, and they rejected the idea that the West was a force for good. And here is the tragedy. Those hippies didn't disappear when the 60s ended. They went to grad school, they got tenure. They became the journalists, the professors, and the politicians who rule us today. They became the Obamas, the Carters, the Code Pinks, Steve Jobs, and Bernie Sanders of today. The poison they drank in 1968 is now the water flowing through the cooling system of our entire culture. But this self-hatred didn't happen in a vacuum. It had a sponsor. You cannot understand this without understanding Russia and the concept of the Third Rome. For 500 years, Russia has viewed itself not just as a country, but as a spiritual mission. After Rome fell and Constantinople fell, Moscow declared itself the Third Rome, the final protector of the true faith. To them, the West isn't just a political rival, it is the false Rome, the apostates. The Soviets might have been atheists, but that ancient Russian drive to destroy the West remained. They knew they couldn't beat American tanks or American factories. They were too strong to be murdered. So they decided they had to be persuaded to kill themselves. This was the true nature of the Cold War. It wasn't just about nukes, it was a psychological war. The KGB launched a program they called Active Measures. As the famous defector Yuri Bezmenov explained to the world decades ago, the Soviets found a genetic defect in the Western mind, the Christian conscience. It is a culture that naturally feels guilt, a culture that tries to be better. The Soviets weaponized that virtue. They poured gasoline on the fire of the 60s, funding the idea that Western civilization was nothing but racism, colonialism, and oppression. They wanted to demoralize the West so deeply that, as Bezmenov said, it would lose the ability to defend itself even if it wanted to. They introduced the virus of self-hatred, knowing it would eat the West's immune system from the inside out. And it worked. But the Soviets knew that self-hatred alone wasn't enough. They needed a battering ram, and they found it in the Middle East. But let's not give the Soviets all the credit. They didn't build this weapon from scratch. They found it lying in the rubble of Berlin. We forget that the father of Palestinian nationalism, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, spent the war years not in Cairo, but in Hitler's bunker. The Nazis and the Islamists had already forged a pact of blood. Hitler saw in Islam a masculine religion perfectly suited for war, unlike the weak Christianity of the West. So when the KGB arrived in the 1960s, they didn't have to teach the Arabs how to hate the Jews. The Nazis had already done that. The Soviets just swapped the swastika for the kufiya and changed the slogan from blood and soil to human rights. And in its Christian generosity, the West started to import the Arabs in, some through vanity and some through true Christian belief that they're doing good. All thanks to the Soviet propaganda machine meant to destroy Western society. Europe thinks it is importing victims. In reality, it is importing the last surviving battalion of the Third Reich. This is the chapter of history the West has forgotten. The KGB actively forged an alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood. It seemed like an impossible mix, godless communists and pious Islamists, but they shared two common enemies, the West and the Jews. The Soviets taught the Islamists how to speak the language of the left. They rebranded jihad as national liberation. They took ancient religious hatred and repackaged it as anti-imperialism. And the trigger for this weapon was Israel. The Soviets understood that if they could turn Israel into a symbol of Western imperialism, they could unite the entire Third World against the West. They pumped anti-Zionist propaganda not just into Cairo and Damascus, but into Paris, London, and New York. They taught the Western left to hate Israel, knowing that eventually that hatred would bleed back into hatred of the West itself. But here is where the story turns into a tragedy of errors. Both the East and the West looked at the Muslim world, and both saw a phantom. The Russians saw mindless baboons. In their arrogant materialism, they thought religion was just a primitive superstition. They believed the Muslims were useful idiots, uneducated savages they could use to break the West and then crush with socialism once the job was done. They thought they were holding the leash. The West saw noble savages. In their oikophobic guilt, they saw the Muslims as pure oppressed victims. They romanticized their rage. They convinced themselves that if they just apologized enough, if they just accommodated them enough, they would become just like Western civilization. Both were wrong. The Russians didn't understand that faith is stronger than politics. The West didn't understand that you cannot buy off a man who wants to replace you and take your women as trophies. The Muslims weren't mindless baboons or noble savages. They were waiting. They took the Russian guns, they took the Western apologies, and they used both to build a monster that neither side can control. And this brings us to the core of the sickness. Why is the West so vulnerable? Why does the white man's world always eventually attack its own immune system? It is because of a flaw in the operating system. The white man's world evolves by destroying its own limits. It builds a structure, an empire, a state, a philosophy, and when that structure fails, it tears it down and starts over. It operates on a spiral of reinvention. But there is one thing that does not change. One thing that refuses to be rewritten. The constant. The Jew. The Jew is the non-collapsible variable in history. We are the reference point that proves not everything can be edited. And this is intolerable to a civilization that wants to be its own god. To accept the Jew is to accept that there are limits you did not create. So, the white man's system always reacts with the same triad: reinterpret, destroy, replace. This is what happened in Europe. The horror of what the white man did in World War II was the attempt to erase the constant. Hitler tried to physically delete the reference point, but he failed, and that failure broke the European soul. The guilt was so absolute that they fell into a deep, pathological need to blame themselves. They decided that nationalism was the disease, so the cure was to kill their own nations. But deep down, they hate the Jews for it. They hate us, because we are the living proof of their failure. As long as the Jew stands, the European feels shame. And when the Jew stood up, built an army, and created a strong state in Israel, that hatred mutated. They moved from erasure to replacement. They couldn't handle a strong Jew, so in a twisted act of subconscious revenge, they opened the gates to the one culture on earth that hates the Jews even more than they do. By bringing in millions of Muslims who openly want to destroy it, Europe found a way to outsource its anti-Semitism. They can pretend to be the tolerant, multicultural humanitarians, while importing a new final solution to finish what they started. They mashed up their oikophobic self-hatred with a new, imported religious hatred, and they created a monster even uglier than the one they fought in 1945. And the warhead of this cultural missile was the sexual revolution. They told us it was about liberation, about love, but that was the cover story. The real objective was to detonate the nuclear family, because once you sever the bond between sex and the home, you leave the individual defenseless against the state. But it wasn't just about politics. It was about a sickness of the soul. While the West was chanting about free love, Europe was busy proving that the Nazis were defeated in 1945. But since they knew it was a lie, they just rebranded the hate into cinema. They took the concentration camps, the sites of absolute evil, and restaged them with soft lighting and full nudity. They stripped the uniforms of the eagle but kept the whip, turning the Holocaust into a fetish and calling it modern art. From films like Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, to Salon Kitty, to The Night Porter and Nazi Love Camp 27, this was the true face of the sexual revolution. It didn't free the West, it degraded it. It numbed the Western conscience so thoroughly that it could no longer distinguish between atrocity and arousal, creating a moral vacuum that was perfectly primed for the next invasion. The Soviets built the Trojan horse to destroy capitalism. The hippies wheeled it inside the gates to destroy their fathers. And Europe opened the door to hide its shame. But there is a higher law at work here. History calls it the operator. When a system deletes its own calibration, when it tries to run without a checksum, it doesn't just glitch, it crashes. The operator resets the system. We are watching that reset happen in real time. The West has fallen because the white man handed the keys of its civilization to people who don't just want to conquer him. They want to subdue him. And the constant they tried to erase is the only thing left standing in the ruins. So, where does that leave us? Can the damage be fixed? The uncomfortable truth is, no. The confidence of 1945 was not a contradiction of the white man's nature. It was simply the peak of the spiral before the inevitable crash. The white man's system is genetically wired to build empires only to burn them down, so it can try to reinvent itself again. No one can fix it, because this isn't a software error. It is a hardware failure. We have to stop pretending that the Russian and the Western white man are different. They are just two sides of the same coin. Both are driven by a nature that seeks to conquer, to reinvent, and eventually, to destroy itself. They are genetically incapable of learning the lesson of history, since both Christianity and communism are man-made, universalist emotional belief systems. They cannot save the white man anymore. The days of the Crusades have long passed. No one has that type of faith anymore in the Western world. The only ones left are the Jews and the Muslims. God laid down the source code in Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse. For 2,000 years, the white man, whether he speaks Russian, German, or English, has tried to curse the Jew, and for 2,000 years, he has brought the curse down on his own head. He cannot stop because it is his nature. And this is why the Jew is different. The Jew is not white. We do not suffer from oikophobia unless we have allowed that white DNA to corrupt our system like the assimilated diaspora does. There is a tragic mutation in the diaspora, the assimilated Jew. The Jew who desperately wants to be a universal citizen. He spent so long trying to blend into the West, trying to prove he wasn't different, that he absorbed the West's autoimmune disease into his own bloodstream. He looks at Israel, and he doesn't see home. He sees the nationalism his professors told him to hate. He creates a new golden calf called social justice, and sacrifices his own people on its altar, hoping that if he condemns Zionism loud enough, the Gentile world will finally accept him. But they won't. They will use him as a shield, and then discard him. He is committing spiritual suicide in the diaspora, refusing to return to the only place where he is immune, because he would rather be a good Jew in exile than a free man in Zion. The Arab as well doesn't hate himself. The Japanese doesn't hate himself. The Hindu doesn't hate himself. And the Jew, the real indigenous Jew, does not hate himself. We are immune to the suicide virus because we know who we are. The West is dying from oikophobia. Russia is dying from a spiritual cancer. They will burn each other down, just as they always have. And when the smoke clears, the hippies, The Soviets will all be dust, and the empire will be a memory. But the Jew will still be standing in Zion, watching the operator reset the world one more time.